Good afternoon, Jesse. It's very good to have a chance to meet you in person and to have a talk with you like this. And this is the first time, actually, for me being on the interviewer side of one of these things. I'm more used to being in your position of trying to figure out what in the world that other guy is trying to get me to say.
Sure.
So, but I have tremendous respect for the service that you have already provided to your country.
Thank you.
And I would like maybe to start out just by asking you an easy question of how does your experience in the military, fighting your country, for your country, shape your view of politics and what you want to do?
Really good to meet you. I never quite know what to say when people say thank you for your service, but thank you. I went to 7 memorial services on my first deployment to Afghanistan. I served 4 combat tours there as an Army Ranger. You grow up very fast. I was 26, 27. Early on that first deployment, my boss's boss pulled me aside and he said, "Jesse, I fired the last 4 guys in your job." And then he just stopped talking. I said, "All right, sir, what does that mean for me?" And he said, "I don't care if you have enough time, enough resources, enough energy, if your best deputies on R&R, if the Afghan allies we're working with aren't up to snuff, you'll get the job done, you'll get results, or I'll fire you." There are about 100 military veterans running for Congress this year. I served in an elite unit, I served in the special operations community, but we all have that story. And I think it would be a great thing if that ethos, that attitude came to Washington.
Let me take one sort of obvious direction from your military service, which is to ask you about the defense budget and our current kind of foreign policy and defense posture, and in particular the amount of funding that was provided in 2018 in defense authorization and appropriations. Do you think that's appropriate? Is it too much? Is it too little? How do you think about that?
I've served in units that had enough resources in the Army. I've served in units that were under-resourced. It's hard for me to imagine not wanting to be part of a conversation with any political leader who wants to fund our defense budget and our troops. You know, my first year in the Army was near the demilitarized zone in the Korean Peninsula. We were the tripwire between North and South Korea. There's a set of combat units, and we were the tripwire. And on a good day, our life expectancy was about 12 minutes. You don't need to be the intelligence officer to know that a war of choice on a place like the Korean Peninsula would be an absolute disaster. If you add up every casualty we've taken from Iraq and Afghanistan since 2001, that's the first day, if not the first hour, of combat operations in the Korean Peninsula. So to think that we might go to war because of a fight on Twitter, you don't need to be the intelligence officer to know. You know, our life expectancy was 12 minutes, so I think about that a lot. I think implicit in the question is that Congress, one of its solemn responsibilities is international affairs, and I do think we need a new generation of leadership who's going to put country over party, in part because this might seem counterintuitive, but all these veterans running, we've been to the funerals in Afghanistan and Iraq. We understand, you know, these budgets, these weapons programs that are 30 years over scheduled and 50 billion over budget, they weren't saving our lives in Afghanistan or Iraq. It was the really smart investments in software and some of the surveillance technology. I think we need to get away from, it's really frustrating for me when we seem to judge a political leader's patriotism by the size of the defense budget, because the young veterans like me know that there's some fat in there that could be trimmed. So I think you can be incredibly patriotic and support our men and women on the line, while also being really good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So somewhere in there, I think, is the right balance.
Thank you. I'm a real hardware junkie, so it's really hard for me not to ask you questions about the future of the A-10 and such things that seem like obvious economic choices. But let me back you up to Korea, because I think that's a really interesting conundrum. You're right, war would be a disaster. But what about a Korea that has the capability of firing nuclear weapons with ICBMs? What do we do about that?
A North Korean regime with the ability to shoot a rocket or missile with a nuclear warhead on the top of it to reach.
Well, even to Japan, let alone
Japan.
intercontinental.
Unacceptable. There are no good options here. I know that we need to do things like make sure we have positions filled, the senior positions in the State Department that deal with this part of Asia. We know what has worked in the past to some degree. It's sanctions. It's smart sanctions. We are going to need our allies in that part of the world to be part of this conversation, part of this effort. So let's just start with the basics. Let's make sure the positions are filled. Let's make sure that we're working with our allies. There are any person who sits in this seat and tells you, oh, there's an easy answer in North Korea is either lying or pandering to you. We need less politicians who are going to do that. What we need is we know what can work, and it's gonna come down to the basics at the beginning, which is filling positions, working with allies, making sure the budgets for these things are thought through. And one thing I learned in the military is if you want ground truth, you got to go to the ground. We should listen to our commanders and our ambassadors and our folks in the intelligence community on the ground who's given us the most up-to-date insights into what's happening.
Okay, thank you. Let me move, since we don't have the entire day to talk about this, to another kind of topics, and maybe we can come back to this because, well, no, I can't resist. I agree with you about the need to have sub-cabinet level people in place. And it's going to be a while before you are in a position to advise and consent on those appointments, no matter how spectacular your career is. But still, that is not something that the party you're running with has been helpful on. I have a friend who was nominated as Assistant Secretary of Transportation. She would have been in charge of research on AI and all that. She's been languishing for 250 days because she's being held up by Mr. Schumer for a bridge in New York. Not even an ideological issue. And that's true of just hundreds of sub-cabinet appointees. What's your thinking about that kind of confrontational politics?
One of the reasons I can give you a little glimmer of hope. It's a little glimmer of hope. One of the reasons I'm really excited to be part of this veteran wave, this 9/11 generation, is because we want to put country over party. I think holding up, I don't know the details of this particular...
Well, it's not her. It's just true of sub-cabinet officials across the board, agency after agency.
One of the reasons I think we need to put a new generation, new blood in Congress is there are decisions made daily with impacts on the international stage. And we do need a new generation who has the background and interest and credibility. I happen to have a master's in international affairs. I happen to have lived in Syria, taught English to Iraqi refugees before I joined the military. I spent a year near the DMZ in Korea, 4 tours to Afghanistan. Because there are relationships that can happen in Congress with our counterparts on the international stage that will have really important and incredibly important impact. I'm running against an incumbent who last January, 4 other members of a clique inside the House Freedom Caucus tried to travel to the Czech Republic on taxpayer money. Why? They wanted to meet with a political party who's publicly called for the gassing of members of the LGBTQ community and Jews in Roma on taxpayer dollars. I would much rather have a new generation of leadership come who wants to, all these veterans from both sides of the aisle, who wanted to sit down and make Congress working again. There's an organization, this is the glimmer of hope. So there's an organization called With Honor, and they're endorsing veterans this year Noah's Ark style. So when they endorse a Republican, they bring a Democrat, and vice versa. And you have to sign a pledge, and it's things grounded in its military values, integrity, courage, civility. So once a month in office, you'll get coffee with somebody from the other side of the aisle. You'll co-sponsor pieces of legislation. You'll participate in a veterans caucus. The idea is when the party bosses say, no, we're going to vote down party lines, we speak truth to power and say, no, put us in a room and we'll come out with a bipartisan bill. That, I think, is the first step towards fixing the situation you described, which is we have incredibly vital sub-cabinet positions that are being held up because of hyper-partisanship bickering. That's why this new generation, I think that is why I'm so excited about it and I hope to be part of it.
I'd like to figure out, as part of this conversation, how much we actually agree
Oh, sure.
about where those policies should move. And so let me just pick a big one and then make sure we talk about some other things before. Economic policy. I was heavily involved in working on the Tax Cut and Jobs Acts from long before the time that it came up. And suppose you were in the House of Representatives then, and the vote actually wasn't really close. What would you have decided to do? What's your assessment of that bill, and more generally of kind of the state of the economy now, and what role Washington should be playing?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? If you feel like under the tax bill you have more money in your wallet at the end of the month, great. I think we have far too many politicians trying to tell people how they should feel about the state of their checkbook. I don't like bills, whether it is a healthcare act or a tax act that's written by special interests, an hour, and then the senators get an hour. That's 1,000 pages written in hands, passed to them, have an hour to look at it. If you feel like the economy is doing, your personal economic situation is doing great. My job, I don't see part of my job that I'm running for to try to tell you how to feel. Right now we're doing a RV tour. Our district is 12 counties. We're doing 12 counties in 12 days. Part of that is because I think showing up counts and listening well counts even more. I spend as much time as I can with small business owners and leaders in our ag communities. What I hear from them is they just want a Congress who's I don't think politicians can create jobs. I think politicians can create an environment which can be hospitable or hostile to an environment that could be good for job growth. What I hear from, I was with a roofing company owner, happens to be a Republican. By the way, I told him the same thing I tell Democrats and independents. This job, you cast 700 votes a year, so we're not going to agree on everything regardless of party affiliation. Now, this small business owner, it's a roofing company, it's a great example. He is the beneficiary when Congress works, and he bears the brunt when their hyperpartisanship the system is broken. His product is steel. Their costs have gone up almost 100% in the last couple of months because Congress is rocking the boat. Broadband. We have a massive, in our district, we have a massive connectivity issue. They recently invested in a piece of software that allows them to fabricate their own roofing products. They used to have to go down to their competitor down the street and pay through the nose. They don't have broadband. So when it breaks, they can't call tech support who can remotely go into the computer and fix it. The repair person has to come out like it's 1982. When Congress can't get its act together and fix the connectivity problem, they bear the brunt. That's where I think we need a new generation of leadership who understands that and just wants to work together. For folks who compromise is the goal, not a dirty word.
Okay, but I'd like to get a little bit better idea of how you approach the bigger economic questions.
Sure.
Right now, according to a friend's weekly column, the weekly newsletter that he sends me, business and consumer sentiment are at the highest levels they've been for many years, certainly since 9/11.
Yeah.
Leaving aside everything that's happened since then. Manufacturing orders, all the kind of forward indications of how the economy is doing look really favorable. My analysis is that there are two things that are really responsible for that. One of them is the tax relief that was provided in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And we cut taxes on businesses in half. We cut them a lot on consumers.
Sure.
People are spending that money. And the other part is deregulation, something that was very unpopular with the Democrats. And it's occurred, there have been substantial accomplishments there. I've followed regulation through my entire career as an economist, and under both Republicans and Democrats. Bush added more regulations than Clinton did. Obama added more regulations than Bush did. That has come to a stop. And we have some really high-profile cases of redoing the Clean Power Plan, regulations on CO2 emissions from utilities, fuel economy standards for automobiles being rolled back. So let's, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
what's your thinking about those bigger national issues
Sure.
of economic policy, and in particular the role of government as a regulator, and how that relates both to its responsibility to protect the environment,
Sure.
but at the same time, the headaches it causes for those businessmen that you're
Absolutely
meeting with.
So I should tell you, I served 4 combat tours in Afghanistan, and then I got a master's, and then I worked in the private sector. So I worked inside of an investment bank, and I worked as a management consultant. And our clients were the federal government, who was desperately trying to modernize and attain efficiency, and Fortune 500 companies, C-suite leaders who wanted to create jobs. I sat, if you remember the housing crisis and the reckless and irresponsible behavior on Wall Street that in part caused the housing crisis, we were the internal fraud team. So I sat inside of an investment bank. Our job was to prevent the next one. What I saw was a new group of lawyers had just been hired because they were going to be the experts on Dodd-Frank, and I saw a lot of people getting employment because they were going to read this big bill of regulations, and it didn't have an impact on the actual culture inside the bank. It wasn't preventing the next one. I think we need to get away, similar to budgets, to where we've somehow gotten to the point where the number of pages in a piece of regulation is somehow equated to the quality of the regulation. It doesn't work. It needs to be smart. And I think the more pages we have, there's going to be more loopholes, whether it's on regulation for the environment or you name it. If folks feel like their economic livelihoods right now in our district, they're at a high water mark, that's great. I can tell you some of the numbers underlying it are a little bit scary. The rate for unemployment nationally, we're at record lows. I will tell you, in our district, in Maryland's 1st Congressional District, it's twice the national average. That's not good. The median income in our congressional district compared to the median income in the state is about 10% less. That's not. Those are bad. So, for example, I think we need more members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who simply know what a balance sheet is and recognize that there's 2 sides to a balance sheet and care about both sides of the balance sheet. There are 435 congressional districts in the country. There is one that's home to the Chesapeake Bay and the way of life here. Our Bay platform is 10 billion oysters. That's going to do great things for the environment, but it's going to do perhaps even better things for the economy. So I just reject the analysis that an investment in the environment, what's good for our economy, are somehow mutually exclusive, because in our district they're hand in glove. And I think that it's not this new generation, it's not just veterans, it's folks who have worked in the private sector and understand the new things happening because of technology, new things happening in the private sector, and that new perspective and blood in Congress, I think, is going to be a really good thing.
Okay. Let's try some tougher ones.
Sure.
You've probably researched me enough to expect this question. Suppose the Supreme Court did declare that Roe versus Wade was overstepping and threw it back to Congress and the states to deal with abortion. What would you be willing to support as common sense and reasonable restrictions on abortion?
I think if we're going to talk about this topic, folks should know where I stand just in general. I happen to believe in a woman's right to choose. I also think if we're going to talk about this topic, that a death at any stage is a tragedy, and we need to acknowledge that. I think we definitely need to acknowledge that. I think abortion should be safe and legal and rare. I think if the scenario you just mentioned unfolds, there are going to be a lot of legislators from both sides of the aisle flocking to this issue. My only hope is that more women from both sides of the aisle are involved in the conversation. I'm reacting to you as a candidate. I'm also reacting to you as a new father. We have a 5-month-old at home, and my perspective on this is it's hard to separate the personal here. I think a lot of these conversations ought to be at the personal level, down to between a woman and her doctor.
Okay. I don't want to end the conversation at this point, but let me ask you about my biggest concern.
Sure.
Which is that we've seen party line votes consistently on everything that really mattered. And there's a reason for that. The leadership has immense power over the rank and file congressman, especially a first-term congressman elected from a marginal district who's going to be facing lots of competition. Suppose your independent assessment of a policy led you to think that Nancy Pelosi is wrong.
Yeah.
How are you going to stand up to her? I mean, I admit, of those 700 votes, most of them that you cast, you can calculate don't matter. But there are some cases that may be close enough where it does.
Yeah.
And those are the ones where the screws are going to be put on you, and that's where your ability to be independent stands out. How are you going to do that? That is my biggest concern about that's actually my biggest concern about the problems in Congress, that it's not just the people who elect people, it's the ability of the leadership to force their troops to get in line.
I think it's an incredibly fair question. I can give you a little glimmer of hope. You didn't ask, but by the way, I would support new leadership if a speaker vote came up. These veterans, so there's a couple groups. I mentioned With Honor. There's other groups called No Labels, and No Labels, it's the same idea and spirit behind With Honor, just strip out the military element. No Labels right now is 24 Democrats, 24 Republicans. They don't agree on everything, but they understand that we share common problems, and folks in everyone's home districts wants Congress to work. They are counting on this new generation to come in. One thing, if I should tell you about these veterans, is we're coming with a little bit of a chip on our shoulder. We volunteered for Iraq and we volunteered for Afghanistan, and we all went to funerals. And many of us lost friends and colleagues in Iraq and Afghanistan. We came home and some of us have lost friends and colleagues to things like post-traumatic stress. I'm a little biased here because my wife runs a nonprofit to prevent military veteran suicide. We came home to a Congress, it's just this fray of talking heads screaming at each other in cable news, and this cohort of career politicians, of which the incumbent is one, they're not only okay with the fray of talking heads, they actually benefit from it. The glimmer of hope here is that this new generation comes in, and folks are counting on us to raise our hands, speak some truth to power to the party bosses, and say, put us in a room and we'll come out with a bipartisan bill. One freshman congressman by herself or himself is a much different conversation than there's about 100 of us. None of us are going to win, but a lot of us are going to come through, and we're going to represent new blood with a little bit of a chip on our shoulder. And if you go to my website, and I wrote this is not from some consultant, any bill that crosses my desk, does it reflect the values of the folks in our district? Is it in the interest of the country? That's how I'm going to look at these bills. And there are veterans with similar mindsets running, so they're counting on us to speak some truth to power and say no when the party bosses say vote down the lines. Put us in a room, and we'll come out with a bipartisan solution.
Okay. Let me see if I can pin you down a little bit more on another divisive issue. Unlike most politicians who talk about gun control, you actually know the difference between different kind of firearms and how they work.
Sure.
Do you have a some specifics about what you think of as being common sense and logical approaches to the use of firearms?
Yeah, Army Ranger, yes, I could outshoot most 90% of the viewers. My wife happens to be a Republican. She's a former police officer. She could outshoot 90% of the readers and viewers here. I think what's coming into focus after the Parkland shooting is that if you believe Congress could and should play a role in reducing gun violence in our country, there's essentially two groups of people in Congress. And there's the first group recognizes that we have a gun violence issue. It's not just mass shootings. It's certainly a big part of it. And want to have a common sense-led conversation about that issue. How do we get there? How do we fix it? How do we reduce gun violence? And over here you have folks who are in the back pocket of corporate and special interests. And whatever issue it is, for example, we're getting hammered by the opioids epidemic. We haven't talked about that today. Our district, the fatalities are 50% higher than the national average.
Yes.
The incumbent takes hundreds of thousands of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry. One of the reasons I'm not taking corporate PAC money is I don't know I could sit here with integrity and say I'm going to bring courage to the opioids fight. The special interests on this issue, on the gun violence issue, are telling their people in Congress, we can't even have a conversation. They're not going to let us have a conversation. So I think the first step is populating Congress. If you believe we have a gun violence issue, putting people in Congress who just want to have a conversation. The first place to start is background checks. Over 90% of people in our country think they're a decent idea or a good idea. Let's start there. I will tell you, my truck, my vehicle, we got it from, we live in the district, and it's purchased in the district. At the end of, after the ink was finished, my wife, we didn't want to mix business and politics. After the deal was finished, my wife introduced myself to the gentleman behind the counter. He's about in his 40s, white, had about 24 tattoos that you could see. And she said, my husband's an Army Ranger, and he's running to serve you in Congress. And he got very excited about Army Ranger. He said, Army Ranger, that's great. She said, by the way, he's a Democrat. And he said, oh, I have 40 guns. I have hunting rifles. But I do background checks. I use common sense. I'm responsible. Are you here to take away my guns? And I said, no one's here to take away your guns. He said, great. This is the surprise part. He said, great. Because my neighbor has 6 bump stocks. And that guy's a little bit off. What do we do about that guy? That man wants to be part of a common sense conversation about how to reduce gun violence. I get to have that conversation because I'm an Army Ranger. We need more people in Congress who I think can shoot expert on the range, or at least maybe that's too high of a standard. But we need people in Congress who
that's settled for sharpshooters.
Yeah. But we need more people in Congress who want to be part of a conversation.
I agree with you on that. Maybe we could probe that a little bit more, because I was disturbed by your mentioning background checks at first, because we do background checks. I mean, let's leave aside gun shows right now, but every firearm transaction, except if you have a federal firearms license, involves a background check. I don't see how you can make the background check any more extensive. I don't see how you can make it much better, but I do know that they screw up constantly on using the information that's in there.
That's a great point. So the church shooting in Texas, the perpetrator of that shooting, the Air Force was sitting on thousands of records of people who, because of whether it was mental illness or other issues, should not have had access to those firearms. They failed to transfer those documents to federal law enforcement. This doesn't make headlines. We have too many congressmen and congresswomen who are looking to sink their teeth into issues that gets them on camera because they're trying to make names for themselves. This is incredibly important. You will never get famous for doing this, but it's really the nitty-gritty, the incredibly important details of how do we get the oversight right, so we make sure the Air Force or any other branch of our military gets it right and passes that information. That is a no-brainer that could be done. It happens if you populate Congress with people who aren't looking for sound bites and are just looking to get things done.
But doesn't it run you against some of the shibboleths of your party about rights to privacy, keeping mental health records from being accessed by anybody, protecting psychiatrists and others from compulsory reporting? Aren't you going to have to take that on?
I think we've built a political tent that, believe it or not, goes from, on one side, a Bernie Sanders chapter, and all the way to cabinet officials from the Reagan, H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush cabinets. Our election is a referendum on Andy Harris. It's not left versus right. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's a referendum on Andy Harris. I imagine I will be taking positions that will have me at odds with my own party, with folks who disagree with me from left, right, and center. That's okay. It's okay because if we can bring to Congress folks who just want to get Congress working again and think compromise is the goal, not a dirty word, we'll figure it out. I served 4 combat tours in Afghanistan. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, you're very good at bringing the conversation back to that. How about this one? Would you vote to impeach the president?
That comes up on the campaign trail, and I'll tell you what I tell everybody else. Rather than give you a hypothetical, I'm an intelligence officer, so I would want to see the intelligence, the facts, before I would cast any vote. There's this fray of talking heads screaming at each other on cable news. Our platform is, we talk about opioids because it's a huge issue in our district. We talk about the Chesapeake Bay, because I know the incumbent's not going to talk about how to get the 10 billion oysters. We have seniors wondering about Medicare and Social Security. If I can bring you back to my website, it's does whatever bill crosses my desk, does it reflect the values of the folks in our district? Is it in the interest of the country? I'm going to vote my conscience. And the way life works is that vote could come up in the third day in office, it could come up the third to last day in office. And I'm going to vote my conscience, whether it's going to help my re-election chances or hurt my re-election chances. That's how I see these things.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been a great opportunity to have a conversation with you. I believe in fairness. Is there anything that you haven't had a chance to say that you wanted to in thinking about, maybe just the attitude that I have shown toward your candidacy and some of these issues?
I'm really curious. I talked a lot about the new generation of leadership, or putting country over party. What are your thoughts about this new generation that's coming?
I have serious concerns about the quality of education and moral formation that most people your age and younger have experienced. I think that our schools have moved from inculcating moral character, respect for the country, to promoting perverse lifestyles, to pushing a brand of moral relativism that validates kids who think that the only thing that matters in life is being happy, and that the way they're happy is by discovering what it is that they want to have and going out and getting it. And so I see a huge divide between those of you who have served in the military, had that experience, and you're a tiny proportion, unfortunately. Yeah. We no longer have a draft. We have no kind of national service. We have a huge cohort of basically selfish young people who are poorly educated in far more ways than just understanding the nature of virtue and how to pursue it. Yeah. And so, can you lead that group? Can you bring them back to something that makes any kind of sense? I'm sorry, you talked about generations, and that's my reaction. I don't know if you ever read Robert Heinlein, but one of the lines in Starship Troopers, which some people think is a kind of an anti-war novel, others think it's a fascist novel.
It is
but
a
was
Rorschach
that
test for I'm
right.
with you. Yeah.
But it was, if you want to vote, you perform your national service.
Yeah.
And I increasingly am wondering how we're going to long at a country if we don't have far more people having had the experience you had. Yeah. I didn't serve, my wife did.
Oh, wow.
She was a Navy nurse in the Vietnam War era, and she served with the Marines. And she sees that as, she had something that formed her in her 20s in ways that I hope I've managed to get to by the time I'm 70. Yeah. And so, that's why I said what I did about your service. It wasn't meant to be a kind of thank you for your service. It changes people. Yeah. And I believe that it changed, that it had a profound influence on you. But the notion that your generation is going to be running things does not make me comfortable.
I think that's an incredibly fair place to be coming from. I'm a millennial. I'm a different kind of millennial because I served in the military.
Right.
If you're concerned about my generation, the next generation probably scares you even more. Mm-hmm. Right. Our generation, my generation, is going to be the only chance to reach the next one. So we're going to have to be the bridge, because if it's not us, there's no alternative. We have a supporter in our tent who is a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat who's a Navy nurse, and she spends time in a hospice with George W. Bush's Secretary of the VA, who's supporting us. Mm-hmm. They have a bond because they work together in hospice. That should be politics shouldn't even enter that conversation. I had a chance to sit down with him, and he's been helping me on a number of issues, including veterans issues. You didn't ask, but I plan on putting one of our district offices in the Cambridge VA facility because we have 50 to 75,000 vets.
Right.
And I don't want them to have to navigate a bureaucracy from 1,000 miles away. I want them to have to walk 6 feet to one of our people. Right. I think the toxic elements in American politics today, we agree on it. It's gerrymandering, it's campaign finance, it's a lack of shared identity as Americans. I think really the long-term fix is national service. And I don't think it should be restricted to the military. I think if you're from Nebraska and I'm from Massachusetts and we spent 2 years on a work project in Tennessee, or we're teaching English in New Mexico, or handing out malaria pills in Guam, that shared experience, we're sweating together, we're going through a combined hardship together, it's going to be so much more difficult to go back to, I'm forgetting my analogy, Nebraska and Massachusetts, right, and lob insults at each other, partisan insults, because we actually are going to have a shared understanding. I think that's our best tool we can bring to this you're describing a society being ripped apart. I think national service is probably the best way to fix it in the long term. The vast majority of American people think it's a good idea. We just need more people in Congress, in the House and the Senate, who actually want to make it happen.
And we have to do the numbers. I've actually have had a column on this sitting on the shelf for a long time, and my problem is I look at the numbers and I see we have far more than you would ever want to try to get into the military.
Sure. And the military doesn't want them.
And the military, exactly.
Yeah.
And so how we can finance, affect a national service for 2 years worth of our population is a really big economic problem. And if I could figure out the answer to that, I mean, I agree with you. I agree with you that it is about the only single way of bringing people together that we know works and has worked wherever it's been used. Figuring out how are we ever going to put those 2 years worth of age cohorts to work.
But if it's on the shelf, what have you seen in your research? What are you drawn upon?
I was just doing some very simple numbers on the number of 18 and 19-year-olds compared to the maximum intake of the draft, for example, during the Vietnam War, and it's a factor of 10 larger. And so, not being one who thinks that digging holes in the ground and filling them up again is a productive thing to do, we need to think much more broadly. How do we fit them into our healthcare system? How do we make volunteer work into national service in a way that works? But I'm going on about something that I admittedly don't know what to do. It's just that the numbers are very hard to figure out a way to cover in today's economy.
So General McChrystal this is his pet project right now. It used to be through
McChrystal?
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's it used to be through the Aspen Institute. I'm not sure if it still is, but he's I think if a national conversation emerges, it's going to be because he's leading it. And
excellent.
I haven't looked at it in a while. Right. We have to figure out. I'm sure there's people looking at rather than what do you say? Digging holes to nowhere.
Digging holes and filling them up again. Yes.
I'm sure there's people looking at what is the right blend. The Peace Corps can get a little bit bigger, the AmeriCorps, but I'd like to I'm looking forward to reading the column then when it comes out.
Oh, thank you. I will work on it. But I think that's a great note to end on, and thank you very much for the time we've been able to spend together.
If anything, we're not supposed to agree on everything. We're a two-party system, but we're supposed to share the same idea that Congress is supposed to work, and we share similar goals. And the fact that we're having this conversation, I wish was happening more and more around the country. So thank you for just letting me be a part of it.
Well, I do too. Thank you.
Yeah.